And I think I might have mentioned something about consequentialism that was referencing that article to Friedman, and then him and I just got into it for a while. It was a blast. Anyways, what was funny, though, is that Scott Alexander was there, and the man did not say a word the entire party. He basically just stood. He's a very tall dude with glasses. He just kind of did this and was just like observing. I'm like, this motherfucker's writing an essay right now. But to the listeners, so we're trying to move into video, but Ben doesn't think it's going to work, or he's doing this begrudgingly.
I just don't think anyone cares.
All of our listeners need to stop listening to podcasts and go to YouTube and just watch us, because then they will get those click counts up, and then I will be able to say, I fucking told you so.
Yeah, the funniest comments on our YouTube are always people who are confused by... They're like, you guys have pretty good quality content. Why do you have no listeners? Like, yeah, our SEO game on YouTube is not the highest.
Yeah, but I feel like we have just been like you and I in a while. I missed you, buddy.
Dude, I know.
What's going on your side? How's your life?
Yeah, it's just having a good time. Nothing to complain about. Life's pretty good. Smooth sailing. How about you?
Hell yeah. Yeah, things are good. Went to that Vibe Fest festival 3 weeks ago.
Oh, nice.
Which is a lot of fun. Yeah, met a lot of really cool people, and everyone are just like micro celebrities like us, like Substacks with 20 readers or podcasts of our size, very tiny. And so you just go up to any group of people and they're just having interesting conversations, and
nice.
And you just chat for 3 hours about random stuff. And nice. One night I was like super stoned and someone said Bayesian something, and then
oh no,
I just made a comment, and then
5 hours later,
literally 5 hours later. But that's what's so cool about this like festival thing, is everyone just like is really interested and really wants to learn. Yeah, there's one person who is doing reform in the United States with regards to institutionalization. And so like if you're psychotic like I was, and you have to be institutionalized for a period of time. I guess in the States it can be pretty brutal. And so I was telling her about my experience, and what she was saying is that basically like the fact that I essentially got like a hotel room, and then after I was discharged was followed by a psychiatrist for like 2 years. But that's essentially like unheard of. And so BC has maybe the best international mental health care.
Oh wow, really?
Of any place. Yeah, like she's like, I've never heard that story in my life. And so it just speaks to like, the liberal BC, if you're gonna have a mental health crisis, like do it there.
That's what it is.
Yeah, but
is Canada in general very good, or BC in particular?
So I think she said Canada is better. She wasn't as familiar with the rest of Canada. But what she said is, it's she's heard of a couple places. I guess Edmonton also has like these hotel room style spots. Like the alternative is like you're in like a dormitory in a bunk bed with six other people who are screaming all night and like
Jesus
like
Christ.
the straitjacket shit, like very much like what you'd expect to see in the movies. And so this person, her brother, was institutionalized, and then he committed suicide, I guess, a couple years later.
Oh wow!
And so that's why she's very interested in reform.
I also learned on Friday I was on a date with this woman who is a therapist for pedophiles.
Oh wow!
Yeah. Whoa!
So is that how you met her?
And, yeah, she's my therapist.
You should be dating your therapist, Ben. You should not be dating your therapist.
Tell her that, man. That's an abuse of power.
Yeah. Oh my god, that's funny.
I'm the victim here. Yeah.
Well, you do look very young, so
yeah. Maybe she's the pedophile.
Sorry. All right, yeah, I'm listening. Yeah.
Do what you love. They say. Do what you love.
Nice.
Anyway, she mentioned in passing that Canada is also ahead of the game with respect to all sorts of stuff around like sexual abuse and sexual trauma and dealing with all this stuff, and the US is lagging behind in that sort of care. So I didn't know that. Good for us. Probably because we have like 10 people in the country, but
yeah. So pedophiles come to Canada. That's what you're saying.
yeah, exactly. North
pedophile, we're taken.
We're open door policy for all the pedophiles.
Yeah, the boys are young and the healthcare is great. No, but so I heard from Dan Savage a long time ago that if you are a pedophile in, I want to say either the United States or maybe most places in the world, you actually can't tell your therapist that because they're obliged to report it to the police or something. But he was kind of one of the few places that would talk about, quote, the gold star pedophiles. So these are pedophiles who, like, they know they can never act on it, they never will, but they're basically living a life of absolute mental torment because
that's horrible.
It's like it's a sexual attraction that they could never act on ever.
Yeah,
And so such people have no one to really talk to because, or again, my information is maybe 10 years out of, but at least 10 years ago when I was listening to him talk about this, like they had no one to talk to because if they would tell their therapist, then the therapist would have to report. And so I'm curious, like, did she say anything along those lines?
She's specifically works for like a detention center. So she's basically like tangential to the prison system already. So these people are like convicted sex offenders, and then she's acting as their therapist, right? So she's like part of the whole network. So it's not as if she's a private therapist and then she, says a sign on her door that says open to pedophiles.
That's interesting. And so does she like her job? Like, I don't know how deep you got into it, but
she really liked it. She was interested in all of Ayla's fetish research as well. She hadn't heard of Ayla before. Nice. So we've gotten some interesting chats around that. But yeah, it took her like 2 hours into the date to tell me who she was actually talking to. She opened, she was like, I learned she was a therapist. Then we talked about that. And then I kept asking her about her job. And eventually she's like, okay, I work with pedophiles.
That is so fascinating. Yeah, I can see why she'd want to be a little bit mum about that, like.
Yeah, hi, my name's X. I work with pedophiles.
yeah. And I love them. Oh, brother. Yeah, welcome back to another episode of Increments. I am Vaden Masrani, a senior research scientist in machine learning, and my boy, Mr. Benjamin, not a Yahoo Chug. How was that one?
That was your best one yet, I think. Yeah, that was pretty good.
Benjamin, not a Yahoo. That was pretty good. From Carnegie Mellon University, and what's on my little list of podcast shit to say. We're on Patreon, we're on Twitter. We just started a YouTube channel. Well, so we've had a YouTube channel for a while. We just started doing video. I think it's going to be a bit spotty. Our first video was with Ayla. We thought put a nice like symmetrical face right on the
hide our faces.
Thumbnail would be a great, high definition, symmetrical, appealing features face to kick off the video stuff. But let us know what you guys think about that. I know that Ben is unconvinced that it's going to matter given the extra editing that we have to do, but I've heard some positive things already. So if you let us know that you like it, that'll be great. If you let us know that you don't like it, well, I'll just ignore that and keep going anyways. Today we are talking about Mr. Scott Alexander's not his most recent piece, but a recent piece defending Bayesian statistics. And it's been sent to us by a number of people now. And so figured we should respond. I think I'm planning, or I've commitment trapped myself to writing a blog response to it. So I don't know if most of my thoughts are fully formed. So this is kind of part of the sausage making process that you guys will see in this episode. But hopefully we'll bat some ideas around, and then when it actually comes out in written form, it'll be a bit more polished. But yeah, I don't know. That's my setup.
Okay, yeah, I think so. He presents. Okay, so the title of the piece is "In Continued Defense of Non-Frequentist Probabilities." And overall, the claim is that probability is a valid and useful construct. You can assign probabilities to anything, and it's a meaningful thing to do and helps you reason about the world. And so basically, the argument is in favor of Bayesianism, where you want to label your beliefs about the world with a number. And he's arguing that that's a helpful and useful and valid thing to do.
Yep.
So we know he's been a Bayesian for a while, and this is obviously something that we've talked about before, and we know we diverge from the rationalist community on, and that I think we actually see the consequences of this sort of reasoning borne out in practice, right? So it kind of came to a head, I guess, with long-termism and stuff, and that's a sort of an extreme example of the differences between how someone like Scott maybe thinks about probabilities and how you and I'm not sure exactly how we aligned we are about how to think about probabilities, but certainly we're more aligned than someone like Scott is to us. So we're close to one pole. Mm-hmm. And so he makes 5 arguments throughout this piece, some of which are sort of closely related to one another. And I think we'll just take those each in turn. So maybe at the outset, I'll just say I'm not. So, so he's defending non-frequentist probabilities, meaning that you can assign probabilities, especially to one-off events that aren't defined in terms of their relative frequency of having happened in the past. So the school of thought that says you can only assign probabilities to events that have happened a bunch, and then you can weigh up their relative frequency, is called frequentism, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. I'm not coming at this piece. So I'm going to be critical of Scott's take here, but I'm not coming at this piece as a frequentist. I also agree that frequentism has many problems. So I don't consider this, at least from my end, to be a debate of pro-frequentism versus anti-frequentism or anything. I am going to be more so just critical of how he thinks about probabilities. And then I'm going to be closer to what you have called like the instrumental theory of probability. And I'll get into what I mean by that in a second. But maybe I'll let you respond to that and fill in any gaps.
No, I totally agree. I think we are probably going to be 100% aligned. If there's any interesting differences between you and I would love to explore those. But yeah, I just wanted to comment on the Bayesian frequentist thing, because that is like totally outdated. That is a completely outdated debate. No one's really having the Bayesian frequentist debate anymore. And the only time it tends to come up is when Bayesians are challenged. They turn it into this Bayesian frequentist thing, I find. But in all statistics and machine learning departments everywhere, everyone uses both methods. They're both completely mathematically valid. From a philosophical perspective, they both have equal problems with them. And so to criticize Bayesianism is not to then fall back and say, well, frequentism must be the right thing. In the piece I wrote, the second of the long-termist series pieces, titled, I forgot what it's titled, the second one. That's where I spell out the instrumentalist view of probability. And that basically just means we aren't trying to find an interpretation. You don't try to find an interpretation of a neural network or an interpretation of a hammer. It's just a tool. And so if you just view it as a tool, then it's just an instrument that you can use to get useful things done. And so like the whole Bayesian frequentist thing doesn't make too much sense when you just see how widely probability is used across so many different scientific disciplines. So in information theory, for example, probability is used as a means of measuring like surprise or measuring the amount of information contained in a particular message. Is that an interpretation of probability? Well, no, I would say that's just a way that probability has proven itself to be useful. But you don't view probability as truly being about information, or some people could, but I don't. Similarly, in physics and in like statistical mechanics, you use it as a means of representing gases or like particles and boxes, which is again different than how the physicists use it. Where probability could arguably not be said to be instrumental is when we're talking about quantum mechanics and fundamental properties of the universe, and that's the one place where I just put my hands in the air and say,
it sort of remains.
I don't really have I don't know. So if we separate that particular use case of probability out from the conversation, because that's just a very thorny physics issue, then I'm never going to be defending, quote, the frequentist interpretation, because it does have problems with it. What I am defending is just, let's quit trying to figure out how to interpret probability, man, and let's just recognize that it's a very useful tool to be used in across circumstances. And so just to the listeners, the main critique that I have about all the misuses of probability is very simple. Just, are you using data or not? And what I'm not saying is that if you don't use data, it's invalid. What I am saying is that's like the first just like thing to check. And then using that, you can start figuring out if probability is being used as beliefs or trying to be used as a means of summarizing information and summarizing data. But when Bayesians like Scott Alexander, whom we've just been praising in the previous series, because he's great on all subjects except for this one and the AGI one, I find, when he's pushed, then he switches back into this Bayesian frequentist debate, which again, I just think is totally outdated. So I just want to echo what you're saying.
Yeah, that's good. We should say this piece, so we definitely know he's a Bayesian. This piece in particular, I would say, doesn't actually wade into the details of the Bayesian frequentist history and debate. I would say this one is more along the lines of just arguing that the Bayesian approach is instrumentally valuable. So this can, I think his piece here can fit pretty squarely into just like, when is probability useful? And he thinks it's useful basically in more situations than I think it's useful. In particular, he thinks that people assigning numbers to these sort of one-off events and every sort of belief they have is useful. And yeah, I agree. When push comes to shove, he's going to back that out in terms of actual Bayesian philosophy. But this piece in particular is very just utility oriented, right? He's just arguing that this is a useful, valuable thing to do and can help you reason more clearly about the world.
Well, he does a little bit in, I don't know which part, but when he's like, well, what do you want to call this number? I think the best thing to call it is a probability. And because like, I think he uses the phrase like schmobability or something. And so we'll get into it, but I do see that as kind of trying to say that the best way to interpret these numbers is via the lens of belief.
That's a good point.
Sure. From that perspective, he's kind of trying to argue the Bayesian thing as like, if you think about probability this way, then it doesn't have all the frequentist problems. And so we should actually think about it this way. But I totally take your point that that's not his major argument.
Nice. Okay, so maybe up top here, I'll just give my overall critique, and I'll probably get more specific on this as we go throughout the various sections. But just at a high level, I would say his essay and approach elide the differences in where these numbers are coming from in the first place. And by focusing so much on the end result of like the numbers themselves, he's forgetting the process by which the numbers are like being generated. So I would claim there's a very big difference between the probability that, say, like a tech company, Amazon or Netflix, is assigning to you watching some show. Okay, so they have some process running in the background, and they're recommending products to you based on various calculations, and in those calculations involves the probability of you clicking on various things if they show them to you. Okay, that's based on tons of data. There's a model in the background. They're trying to model your preferences, all this sort of stuff. I would say there's an extremely big difference between that sort of process and the probability that someone assigns to us landing on Mars, which is the example that Scott repeatedly comes across. But by refusing to deal with like the actual method by which these numbers are being generated, you forget that the process underlying this is super important. And the reason statistics and probability are so useful is because we first agree on a model, and then we can make arguments using the language of probability about results coming out of that model.
Can I just ask a question? So when you say model in this context, like model is one of these words that I'm always wanting to flag because people mean different things by it. In what you just said, would the word methodology be better suited when you're talking about the difference between, say, Amazon and the probability of landing on Mars? Or do you mean model in a more specific sense there?
Yeah, I mean model in a more specific sense.
Because it's probably worthwhile spelling out what you mean by model, because I continuously get confused by that. And I know that when I was at UBC and I would hear different speakers, they would use the word model, and I could just tell that they were using it in different ways than the previous speaker.
Yeah, interesting.
And so I don't think it's a very well-defined thing. And so it's just one of these words that I like to kind of draw attention to as potentially being a place where you can smuggle in certain assumptions.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. Okay. So let's just start being very concrete. And unfortunately, when you're contrasting Scott's approach to other approaches, sometimes you have to get like slightly technical, but we'll do our best to avoid that as much as possible. But here's like an example of what I would mean by a model. So you might assume that you have like a sequence of observations that you're seeing, a sequence of data points. And you might say, okay, we're going to assume that these data points are being drawn from a Gaussian distribution. That's just like a certain probability distribution, a very common one. To the readers, this looks like it's the classic bell-shaped curve. This is one of the most common probability distributions out there. And with like, say, mean 0 and variance 1. So this just says, okay, I'm going to assume that these observations are coming from this specific distribution. That's what I mean by a probabilistic model. All I mean is like you've constrained what you're talking about mathematically somehow. You've made a simplifying assumption to the world. You have this data. You assume this data is being given to you by some well-defined mathematical process. And then you can use mathematics, and in particular language of probability, to argue about the kinds of things you'll see, right?
Yeah.
So then you can say, okay, the next observation, given that the observations, given that we have this model, we're assuming data are drawn from this Gaussian. So now the probability that the next observation has a value greater than 2 is going to be X%, right? And
can I just return to the example of Amazon recommending shows to its Prime members? So one of the most basic assumptions that you make in statistics and machine learning is the IID assumption: independence and identically distributed. And so in that case, what Amazon would be assuming is that if Ben watches a movie and enjoys it, you're not going to call me and tell me to watch the same movie. Because if you call me and tell me, then that would no longer be, quote, independent. And we know that that kind of thing does happen and that you will tell your friends. But as a statistical modeling assumption, if you make that and you have enough data, then you can start making tractable, successful predictions. And we know that in reality, that's not actually true, that when people see a movie, they're going to tell their friends, and maybe places in like particular area codes, you're going to have different movies that are all taking off because of this. But you just say, okay, we'll just assume that and we'll just make some progress. And in one of the, I don't remember if I made this point in a blog post somewhere, I think I did, that if you view this from the lens of epistemology, then it's obviously a non-starter, because in epistemology, you are actually trying to figure out what is true. And so if you start with an assumption that you know is false, then you're done.
Everything follows.
Right?
Yeah.
But if you're not viewing statistics as an epistemology, which is, I think, what some of the crit rats, some of the mistakes that they make, but you're viewing it as just a tool to get stuff done, then making an assumption like next year in December, there's going to be roughly the same amount of car crashes as last year, will allow you to, say, staff the appropriate number of doctors and nurses. And is this actually true? No. But is this going to save lives? Yes, it is. And so I just want to emphasize that making these kind of statistical assumptions is not necessarily, is not valid from an epistemological, we want to figure out what's actually true perspective, but it is totally valid from a, we want to build shit that works and save lives perspective. And then you can argue about the assumptions with reference to how well you're doing with regards to the goal that you have. And so I just wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah, excellent. And so, okay, so the reason I'm bringing up assumptions and modeling, I mean, maybe we should just put aside a model and just use the word assumptions, right? So like, what assumptions are you making as to where these numbers are coming from? And I think just continuing this conversation, it's useful to refer to the underlying assumptions that are generating these numbers. So, you know, I just gave this like technical condition about like Gaussian distributions, whatever. But that's like a very normal statistical setup you might have, and that allows you to solve various problems. And then if you compare that to, for instance, like a superforecaster arguing about the war, a war in Djibouti, like a civil war in Djibouti in 2026, right? Like, okay, fine. They give you some number, and numbers look superficially akin to one another. So like, what's the difference here? And I think the difference is obvious once you start digging into the assumptions. So now you're not assuming, like, the assumptions are something like, well, this person's gut hunch based on some scattershot of previous life experience that they have and some binge reading of Wikipedia is pretty accurate. And this person thinks that there will be a civil war in Djibouti in 2026, and they give a probability of 3% to this event happening. Okay, so, and then we can argue about which assumptions are better and worse, but just keeping in mind like the actual assumptions that are going on behind this data generating process is super valuable, and I think lets you start drawing a dividing line between, okay, when do we want to start listening to these numbers, and when are they going to be more or less useful? That elides a bit the super forecasting, like, are they really accurate? Are they calibrated? All this stuff. I think we can get into that a bit more, and we've talked about that in the past. But I think, so my high level thing is just like, he ignores the assumptions. And so then you end up treating all these numbers equally. And that's when you get into like the issue with long-termism stuff, right? Where it's like, now you have this numbers of the estimate of number of human people, you multiply that out with another estimate of the amount of good some intervention will do, and boom, you have this number. Anyway, all this is kind of stuff we've said before, but I think is
I just want to make a couple points to echo what you're saying, because I obviously completely agree. The first point is that I just want to say something that you are not saying that I think some people, Brett Hall in particular, make a mistake here. And the mistake is saying that these numbers that are basically scoring your beliefs are completely useless. And you're not saying that, and I'm not saying that either. There are some utilities for these kind of numbers, and we can get into that. It's not that they're useless. It's just that we just need to completely recognize that they are a different thing. They're a totally different thing than if you count miscarriage rates or you count the number of people who have given a 5-star rating to Game of Thrones. Say it's a different thing. And once you recognize it as different, in most cases, in fact, in all cases, I'm going to argue that the data numbers are better than the numbers that are just pulled out of a hat. But numbers that are pulled out of a hat aren't completely worthless. So if you have nothing else to go on except the gut feeling of some senior general who has been in 100 wars in their life, and they say, like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that this military operation is going to be a success. Like, that's valuable information. I would want to know if a 5-star general thinks they're pretty sure it's going to work or not sure. And then if they put numbers on top of that and say, well, I'm 90% sure compared to 60% sure, like, that is valuable information. It's just not the same thing at all as getting an actual objective probability. So I just want to make sure that we're emphasizing that we're not discarding them entirely. And I think that can be a mistake that some people on the critical rationalist side tend to make. They just want to throw it out entirely. The second thing I wanted to emphasize is part of what I'm going to hopefully try to do in the next little while when I write this blog response is come up with some new examples, because the long-termism one is a clear one. But another huge example of where this stuff really matters, what Scott did not deal with at all in his post, and I think that's one of the big weaknesses, is that he did not steelman the other side at all. He just talked about it as if it's some like niche annoying thing that people on Twitter are talking about, but it has real world consequences. And the other one is FTX. Like, my God, if you read Michael Lewis's book, like, you can just see full paragraphs where he spells out like Sam Bankman-Fried's reasoning, and it's all about this kind of stuff. And so if you start taking your numbers so seriously and start viewing yourself as a total genius, then you're kind of going to get drunk on your own probabilities a little bit and start making certain decisions that are completely untethered from reality. And this has led to one of the biggest financial scandals since Bernie Madoff, obviously. And so I'm not attributing this entirely to Bayesianism. I'm like, I could imagine a hypothetical world where he wasn't a Bayesian and maybe the same kind of shit happened. But it definitely didn't help in this circumstance, and it had a role to play in the FTX scandal. And so when we go on and on about this, it's not just because it's some niche philosophical, metaphysical point. It's because it actually has real world ramifications. A third example would be the shrimp sentience conference that we went to, where, like, basically when you have no idea what the fuck you're talking about and you can't really know, and you have to make arguments about are shrimp sentient, then what you do is you resort to this kind of style of reasoning, because this style of reasoning can always buffer your argument. When you are talking completely out your ass, you can always fall back on probability land, because now talking out your ass, what it looks like is citing very complicated statistics papers and throwing you into this math land that makes your argument seem very philosophically robust when it often isn't. And so to emphasize those as examples of where this matters.
Yeah. That, and it lets you start making decisions. And so you can sort of see the appeal, right? So in a place where I'd probably say, okay, we should just admit we have no idea what's going on and like go try and gather more information or like go seek new arguments, etc. If you start putting numbers on things, it's like, well, now we can run some calculations and start doing things. And in some sense, that feels good. And in some cases, that is good, right? Like we want to be actionable and we want to be agentic and do things. But the problem is, if you're always willing to put a number on something, then there's, some downstream decision-making process that you can run on that number. And now you can start doing things in the world. But what you've done is just bootstrap ignorance into decision-making on more ignorance. And it's hugely dangerous.
Nice. So we should start dealing with Scott's actual arguments, because we've just been giving
just been shitting on
stuff.
Him.
So let me just quickly read the 5 section headers, because his 5 section headers basically spell out the 5 arguments that he's going to make. So the first one is that probabilities are linguistically convenient. The second section is probabilities don't describe your level of information and don't have to. The third is what is Sam Sveti better at than you. I'm just going to rephrase that as what is
Sam Mitzvedi, I think.
Yeah, some super great super forecasting organization with an Italian sounding name better at than you. So that's a discussion about super forecasters.
Vaden's Italian is questionable, obviously.
Mamma mia. Do people use probabilities as substitutes for reasoning? And number 5 is AI even more unmodelable than Mars landings or politics?
Yeah, let's start with number 1. So probabilities are linguistically convenient. Scott's argument here is that we're okay with people saying things like very unlikely, extremely unlikely, extraordinarily unlikely, etc. to describe events. And he says, okay, instead of just introducing all these haphazard categories that can't be compared to one another, better to just introduce an integer scale of 1 to 100 and let people say things like they're 5% sure or 95% sure, etc. And this is just a better way and more accurate way of representing people's beliefs. So if you're not okay with this, you better also not be okay with introducing increasingly fine-grained sort of qualitative categories like rarely, extremely, totally unlikely, etc. So I think there's a couple counter arguments to this, but I'll let you go first if you want.
Yeah, well, the first point I wanted to make is that Scott never does this in any of his other blog posts. So he doesn't put numbers on most of his confidence statements. What he uses is natural language. For example, for some of his older posts, he would have an epistemic status right on the top of them. And is his epistemic status a number? No, it's not. It's a natural language description. All throughout his writing, I'm sure you could find some places where he'll embed actual probabilities associated with particular statements, but the vast majority of all of his writing, he doesn't do it. And so my first question to him would be, well, why aren't you actually doing it if you are saying this is so valuable? You seem to only ever talk about this when you're defending the practice, but you don't actually seem to use the practice. And the reason is that, and another example is in his surveys. So he gives these giant surveys, right? What are the scales that he uses in these surveys? Is it a sliding scale or is it 5 points or 10 points? Well, it's 5 points or 10 points, precisely because it actually has quite large diminishing returns when you start making it just a number between 0 and 1. Also, it's not an integer that he's advocating. I don't know if he said that or not, but he's advocating a real number between 0 and 1. So there's an infinite number of different.
Yeah. It is a bit of sleight of hand in his argument there, actually, because at one point he says, yeah, introduce a scale of 1 to 100, but then he also wants you to be able to say 42.11% or whatever if you want to. So,
and then the other thing is, okay, so is it linguistically convenient? Sometimes, yeah, it is. So I'd say that 99% of the time, when I'm using 99% here, I'm basically using it as almost all of the time. You don't use numbers at all because they're just not very helpful. You just say things like, I'm pretty sure, I'm really sure, I'm not really sure, and that's enough to proceed. Occasionally, the conversation is such that, well, I say I'm pretty sure, and Ben's like, well, okay, but how sure are you? Can you be a bit more precise? And so when the conversation demands you get more precise, then it sometimes is helpful to give numbers. Yeah, so in our conversation with Nick Anyos, I think either you or I asked him what his probability that the sun is going to explode tomorrow is. And he said, I'm 99.99999% sure. And you're like, well, why not 1 extra 9? And so then what he did was he said, well, what I'm trying to say is I'm more sure that the sun is not going to explode tomorrow than I am about almost any other thing that I could think of. But I'm sure if you gave me another example like that the entire universe is going to explode tomorrow, then I would be even more sure that that's not going to happen. But so then when you're actually trying to explain what these numbers mean, what you always do is you give a relative ranking between adjacent things you believe, right? And so again, when you need to get more precise, the numbers aren't doing too much. The numbers are just a means of giving a relative ranking amongst different kinds of propositions. And so my main critique, I have other critiques about this particular section, but at a high level is that Scott isn't actually practicing what he's preaching here. And 2, how precise you need to get is entirely dependent on the conversation or what it is you're doing. So there's not an absolute level of precision that is always better. the amount of precision is relative to whatever it is you're talking about. And 3, when you do actually give numbers, the numbers are only ever useful as means of comparing between adjacent beliefs. And so if I say I'm 99.99% sure of something, but then you take that number, you detach it from me, now it's no longer me who's saying it, and it's just somebody else. Well, then it's kind of useless again, because what matters is the person who said it, how they're rank ordering the various beliefs in their head. And so it's about the person who's saying it and their rationale for their beliefs. And so the number itself is rather unhelpful, as evidenced by the fact that Scott doesn't actually use them very often, except when he seems to be arguing about AI or arguing in favor of using them.
Yeah, nice. I'd also say that this just ignores the actual decision-making process that's going on in the background. So he's using the example of people deciding whether we can land on Mars. Okay. And then he says, okay, the head engineer comes to you and says she thinks it's only 5% likely that we can land on Mars without incurring some catastrophe or something. Okay. Mm-hmm. In the real world, do you think that's where the conversation would end? So suppose you're in a boardroom with Elon Musk and he says, okay, can we go to Mars? And the head engineer stands up and says, I think there's a 5% probability we can land there. Do you think everyone says, all right, let's go home? Yeah. No, of course not. Everyone, and you can predict what the next sentence is going to be. It's going to be, why do you think there is a 5% probability? And then what's going to happen is she's going to enumerate all the reasons she thinks it's 5%. No one's going to give a flying fuck if she said 5% or 15% or 40%. Now they're just going to talk about the reasons. Like, which one of these are actually problems? Does anyone know more about this? Is this insurmountable? Is this not? Then they're going to make a decision. And so, you'll start at the superficial level of numbers. When you actually disagree about anything, which of course is going to happen, you descend to the level of like, how'd you generate that number? And what can we do about it? Do we all agree? Like, do you have good reasons for your number? Okay, etc. Yeah, in some sense, I just want to give Scott what he wants and say, I mean, okay, sure. Like, if you think it's more valuable for the engineer to say 5% versus 15% versus 20%, I'm not going to die on that hill, but no one gives a shit. Like, because in the real world, you care about why she came to that number. And then all our actual decision-making is going to be based on her reasons given. And this ties into your critique of, like, this is what he does in his blog post. He doesn't just he doesn't take some subject and then say 50%. I think the BLM protests increased the number of murders in the U.S. in 2021 or something. Right? He writes 10,000 words long, very thoughtful essays about exactly why he thinks that. So that there's this essay by this superforecaster called Michael Story, who it's a nice essay, and he's just talking about some of the shortcomings of super forecasting and why it hasn't been adopted more in public policy. And he's obviously sympathetic to super forecasting because he's a super forecaster. But I just want to quote this one paragraph, which I thought was insightful. So this is talking about during the pandemic in the UK. He says, during the pandemic, Dominic Cummings said some of the most useful stuff that he received and circulated in the British government was not forecasting. It was qualitative information explaining the general model of what's going on, which enabled decision makers to think more clearly about their options for actions and the likely consequences. If you're worried about a new disease outbreak, you don't just want a percentage probability estimate of the future case numbers. You want an explanation of how the virus is likely to spread, what you can do about it, and how to prevent it, right? And so, first of all, I commend him for writing this, because he's obviously bought into the superforecasting thing, right? So this is him writing against his own best interests in some sense. Nice. But it just says, like, when real decisions need to be made in the world, you never rely on someone's just gut probability about these things. Yeah. And so, if you want to die on a hill saying, like, you should, like, sure, you should be able to give your probability. That's fine. But what we really care about is your argument. So the whole thing sort of just elides the fact that, like, at the end of the day, we want to make useful decisions, and that's not going to come down to arguing about whether it's like 5 or 6%.
Well, and not only that, but like, if he really believes what he's writing, then he wouldn't be writing. He would just have the title of his post, and then a number associated with how strongly he believes it, and then the title of his next post, and then a number associated with how strongly he believes it. Because if that's the all that is really relevant here, then you don't need to do the 10,000 word blogs. Just give me an enumerated list of what you believe and how strongly you believe it, and we'll be done. But obviously, that's not how the world works. And what's interesting is that if we can move to the second bullet, or the second main argument, it directly contradicts his first one. So he ends the first one by saying that in this case, demanding people stop using probability and go back to saying things like, I think it's moderately likely, is crippling their ability to communicate clearly for no reason. I just want the listener to keep that part in their head, that it's crippling the ability to communicate, because that's going to come up in about 5 minutes when we discuss the next section.
I do just want to flag that he, as a justification for the first section of giving probabilities, he also says, like, one counter argument is that it introduces a false sense of precision. And I would want to make this argument. This is an argument I would make. And Scott thinks this isn't true because of the success of things like super forecasting and people being well calibrated, which means that the probabilities they're giving are not just totally arbitrary. They're tracking reality in some way. I do want to come back to that, but let's just push that to the super forecasting section because I think that it'll be the same sort of arguments there. So I just want to flag that we're not skipping that necessarily, but we'll come back to it. So the second section is probabilities don't describe your level of information and don't have to. So here the argument is that these numbers that you're giving don't have to account for the reasoning process that got you there, or in other words, the amount of information you actually have for that assessment. A criticism of using probabilities in this way is that you might say 50%. So you're 50% likely to get heads for the flip of a fair coin. But you might also say 50% to something you're entirely unsure about. So like, whether humans will land on Mars, or who's going to be the president in 2200 or something, right? And giving probabilities to these things, so 50% can either be used as like sort of based on our probabilistic model, it's actually 50%, or it's putting a label on your ignorance, basically being like, I have no idea, I have no reason to think it's one way or the other, so I'm just going to give it 50%.
I found that point can be a bit confusing to people. I just want to maybe spell it out in a little bit more detail.
Sure.
So again, this is where the two interpretations of probability really matter. So if you're interpreting it, quote, from the frequentist perspective, I'll keep using my same example of like miscarriage rates, because I think it's very clean. So if I say that given your health at your age, your socioeconomic background, etc., you have a 50% chance of miscarrying in the first 6 weeks of pregnancy, say. That number is representing some sort of counting mechanism somewhere. So you gather a bunch of people who meet roughly the same criteria that you have in terms of health and demographics. And then of those, say, 100,000 people, approximately 50,000 of them would have a miscarriage, something to that effect. That's very valuable information. And if I know that it's 50%, that comes from
is it actually 50%?
I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure for some class of people it would be. I'm just using easy numbers.
Sure.
But if you interpret it from the Bayesian perspective, so now Bayesian perspective is that you assign probabilities to sentences, to English sentences, to propositions, to statements. And so now here the choice is you will miscarry or you won't miscarry. And if you have no information whatsoever, if you're completely ignorant, then you can't assign greater probability to one of those sentences or its negation. So you have to put the probability mass exactly equal on both of them. And so in that second case, what is meant by you have a 50% chance of miscarrying is I have no fucking idea whatsoever at all. I'm just completely ignorant to it. And what Scott is going to argue here is that it doesn't matter his argument's a bit actually weirder than that. Is that it's not the job of probability to tell you that information. And like, why are you even asking probability to do that? You're being unreasonable to even expect probability to make that distinction. And that's what he's going to surprisingly argue in this section. But I just want to spell out why the two interpretations lead to the same 50% number, meaning radically different things.
And so, that's exactly right. So he's saying it's totally fair to just assign 50% to all these things, regardless of whether it's coin flips or regardless of whether it's just something you have entirely no notion about. And that's fine. And my counter argument is basically, no, that's not fine. There's just a huge practical difference between me saying the probability of ever entering quantum mechanics or something being 50%. I have zero idea about like whether the multiverse theory is true. No idea. It would be insane to plug that number into some downstream decision-making procedure versus the number where you're saying the probability of heads given this fair coin is 50%. Those are completely disanalogous situations, and basically just everything we were saying at the beginning of like this is where the consequences of this kind of stuff matters, because now you're assigning the same number, and the assumptions of where this number is coming from are totally forgotten. And now they look like the same number on paper, and you can start making decisions with them. And it's just I can't even get behind the intuition of like how this difference doesn't matter. Like how could how like one is a no, like so there's a concept called radical uncertainty, which is not bought into by the Bayesians at all, but is bought into by everyone else basically, that says some situations are just you have no idea about them. It's silly to try and quantitatively describe your uncertainty. There are certain situations like classical risk assessments and stuff, right, where like probability is useful, but sometimes you're reasoning about things that are so like there's unknown unknowns. You can't it's just the future scenario is so vague. Then you're in a position of what's often called radical uncertainty, and to try and use the normal tools of probability here doesn't make sense. And Scott basically wants to say, no, there's no radical uncertainty is not a class of problems that we should be worried about, and you can always just assign a number to whatever you want and then carry on using that number in the same way you would as if you got that number from like some very well-defined probabilistic model.
Yeah, I think it's worth reading what he actually says so that people can hear it in his own words and hopefully see that we're not strawmanning. And actually, the one meta comment I had about this is that is one of these instances where I'm noticing, and it's very rare that I would ever say this about Scott because he's brilliant, where his very strong writing style, he's a brilliant writer, can actually distract from what is going on. And so he uses a very colorful analogy here. And this colorful analogy is so bullshit. But let me say the whole thing. So there's two paragraphs that I'll read. So is it bad that one term can mean both perfect information, as in the first case, so in the counting miscarriage rates example, and total lack of information, as in I have no idea what your miscarriage rate is. He uses different examples, but I'm just using miscarriage rates. So is it bad that one term can mean both these things? No. This is no different from how we discuss things when we're not using probability. And then he gives the following example. Do vaccines cause autism? No. Does drinking monkey blood cause autism? No. My evidence on the vaccine question is dozens of excellent studies conducted so effectively that we're as sure about this as we are about anything in biology. My evidence on the monkey blood question is that nobody's ever proposed this, and it would be weird if it were true. Still, it's perfectly fine to say the single word answer no to both of them to describe where I currently stand. If someone wants to know how much evidence and certainty is behind my no, they can ask, and I'll tell them. Skipping another example where he does basically the same thing. Then at the end, he says, likewise, if I answer that there's a 0.001% chance vaccines cause autism and a 0.001% chance monkey blood causes autism, it's not the job of probability theory to tell you how much effort went into that assessment and how much of an expert I am. If you care about that, then you can ask me. Okay, so my response to this is that he is crippling my ability to communicate by dogmatically asserting that we can never distinguish between the style of probability that's being used associated with this number. I think some old logicians, I don't remember who, they would actually do like a P with a little subscript S or a subscript like P1 or P0, just to indicate the kind of probability. Yeah, that is a totally valid thing to do. And that's what mathematicians are doing all the time when they want to reduce ambiguity. And what's so weird about this is that it is the most common case that when you have a single word that represents multiple things and people are confused, then what you do is you differentiate that word into different kinds of words. So we have one word called computer. And if I wanted to distinguish between a MacBook Pro and an iPhone, both of these are called computers. What I wouldn't say is, well, it's not the job of the English language to differentiate between a MacBook Pro and an Android phone. If you want to know which kind of computer I'm talking to, you can ask me. But I'm not going to change the words. I'm not going to differentiate different kinds of computers. This is insane. Language just continuously evolves whenever there's ambiguity and people are getting confused. And these confusions have significant real-world ramifications, as in the case of long-termism and FTX. And in fact, language, if you take any two adjacent words that mean something kind of similar, they're going to have a parent root word that refers to the set of both of those things. And what Scott is saying is you can never take the parent root word and split it into sub words. And he's used a ridiculous monkey blood analogy, which is just a distraction because it's kind of funny when you read it, but is just totally misunderstanding how language works. And the point of language is that it continuously evolves whenever there is ambiguities. And so it is just so bizarre to me that he would just cross his arms and say, no, I'm not going to distinguish between these two things, when clearly there's ambiguity here. So why not just subscript your little p's? Like, it's be very trivial to put a little subscript to indicate the kind of probability you're talking about. And it just is a very bizarre argument for him to make after he just complained about the other side hamstringing his ability to communicate. And that was the main thing that I saw in this section. Yeah, it's one of the weirdest arguments from him I've ever encountered in my life. And it's so atypically bad that it just like shows how this Bayesianism stuff can really just grab a hold of very smart people.
Yeah, I agree. I thought this section was like shockingly bizarre, and to just say like,
it's not the job of probability, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. You can't make me. You can ask me. Well, like, that's part of the other argument that we're making, is that we are always going to ask you where you got the numbers from, because the numbers themselves don't really mean too much at all. And so it's a completely bizarre argument. And notably, so the this is slightly off subject, but it's related. So a couple posts later, he wrote a really bad piece about AI. And AI doom and gloom and stuff. And I was considering maybe trying to write a response to that too. But then when I scrolled through the comments, most of the commenters had actually picked up a lot of the bad parts of his argument. But that doesn't seem to be the case with this post. And so just the fact that the commenters aren't noticing a lot of these things, I think indicates that there is still a huge amount of confusion on this subject compared to the AI stuff, where, there's still like a culture war. It's still front of the culture war, and there's going to be strong opinions on both sides. But most of the kind of things that I would want to say in response to Scott's post about the AI stuff, just for the listeners, it's desperately trying to fathom the coffee apocalypse argument, where he's talking about how people in the past have forecasted that the world is going to end, and now people are forecasting that the world's going to end with AI. And so people like myself would want to say, well, we should lower our credence, quote unquote, on these claims. And so he's going to argue against that analogy. But the commenters picked up a lot of the problems with it, but not so in this case. And I think that just indicates that there's still a decent amount of confusion around the probability subject, which he is explicitly saying he is not going to help reduce. That's what he's saying with this post. He's like, I recognize there's confusion, and I'm not going to do anything I can to help that. I'm just going to leave it confusing. And if you're confused, you can send me an email. Which is an insane thing to write. So
it's fascinating. It's so I've said multiple times in writing and on the podcast that I'm a big fan of Scott, and I love his writing. I think he's brilliant, and like a once in a generation essay writing talent. But it is fascinating to read him. Like, I'd say most stuff he writes about, I don't have absurdly strong positions on, right? Like, he's touching tons of subjects, and I'm just interested I'm along for the ride in some sense. Like, I'm just, ready to be persuaded in either direction. It's interesting to read him when you do have very strong opinions about a specific subject and like know a lot about it, right? And you pick up on, like sort of like you said, certain stylistic things. And it kind of makes you wonder, are these things there all along? Like, where, like you need, like in the, he's still brilliant regardless, right? And like, there's a reason we're discussing his essay on Bayesianism as opposed to someone else's, because it's well written and thought provoking. But it does make you think about, okay, there's probably another side to a lot of these things where he writes an essay and you think he just demolishes some position. There's probably another side to be had there that you're not receiving the full, you're not receiving the full benefit of hearing about. This the newspaper effect.
Exactly.
And which is
that what's actually called, the newspaper effect? Is it called the newspaper effect?
No,
you should maybe spell it out for the audience who doesn't know what we're talking about. But
so I mean, the audience, probably most people in the audience have had this happen to them, where you'll know some field or subject very well, and you'll read a reporter discussing it in the New York Times, say, and you'll read the piece and realize, wow, they got a lot of stuff wrong, or they're lacking a lot of nuance, or there's some just basic misunderstandings of how this field operates, right? So if you're this happens all the time if you're for instance, an actual ML researcher, or know these things, and you read about someone writing a piece about AI or ML in pick your favorite newspaper, and yeah, it's just shockingly bad always. But then there's this effect where people often forget that once they turn over the page of the newspaper or scroll to the next story, and then they take everything they hear at face value. Right. But what should really be going on is like reading a story by someone where the content very well. And if you see it being very inaccurate or misleading, that should sort of lower your confidence that anything you're reading in the newspaper about any subject is very accurate. Right. And so it is kind of scary when you come across a popular article on something very well to see how misleading it can be. And then you have to sort of try and translate that reasoning to every other story you come across. And so, there's a specific name for this effect. And I'm not sure if the effect refers to the fact that you often forget how misleading it was when you start reading about other things, or if the effect is the realization that a lot of the stuff you're reading is probably BS and wrong. But anyway, I
just Googled it. I don't think it's called the newspaper effect, but I don't know what it is called, but I was thinking the exact same thing. No, for sure.
Yeah, that did happen to me. He's still a brilliant writer, and I respect the shit out of him. But it did happen to me a bit reading this essay, where I was like, "Oh, okay, dude." Like this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, let me just be a rank partisan here and say, like, this is where critical rationalism kicks in the sense that, like, the reason I do trust him is he will put his writing online for everyone to read and critique. And then things like, for example, his brilliant ivermectin piece, right? So like if he was doing that kind of shady thing, then people would respond back to him. And Scott is exceedingly brilliant at like taking the criticism, which is coming back at him, and either changing his mind, changing his post, or responding to the criticism in turn. And so that mechanism of, if he's being a bit shady, then he's pretty good at, I don't even want to say shady. I don't think it's intentional. I think that it's just this is how he writes. He's a brilliant writer. And so he's going to use colorful analogies, but he's doing it in service of a point which doesn't actually work. And so that's where all that criticism stuff comes. Anyways, partisan.
Yeah. I'm just jealous because I'm not as prolific of a writer is what's really going on. I don't know how he writes essays so quickly. It's
he writes faster than I can read, man. It's insane. It's he writes a new post before I've finished like 3 of his other posts.
Did you see that thing where someone asked him how do you write so quickly? And he said the mystery to him is not why he can write so quickly, but why everyone else writes so slowly. Because he said, you're having thoughts. Why don't you just write those thoughts down on paper? And that's an essay. And all of us who struggle, proofreading something a billion times and editing the shit out of it, we're just so jealous because he's thinking his thoughts in perfect essays.
Well, okay.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, so not only is he doing that, so I met him once, right? Did I tell you this story? When I was living in the Bay Area, there was just a meetup at David Friedman's house. And so I went just on my own and met Scott Alexander and ended up arguing with David Friedman for like 3 hours about consequentialism or something. I don't remember.
Probably libertarianism, to be honest. Right?
So it was libertarianism because I didn't know much about libertarianism back then, but it was some related, because I think Scott argues part of his critique against libertarianism is against the moral stuff. And in place of the coercion is always wrong moral framework, he argues for just a very reasonable style consequentialism. And I think I might have mentioned something about consequentialism that was referencing that article to Friedman, and then him and I just got into it for a while. It was a blast. Anyways, what was funny, though, is that Scott Alexander was there, and the man did not say a word the entire party. He basically just stood. He's a very tall dude with glasses. He just kind of did this and was just like observing. I'm like, this motherfucker's writing an essay right now. This is exactly.
He's writing 2 essays.
Yeah, exactly. So he goes to these Bay Area parties, and then he just does this, and he just like he doesn't like participate. He's just like there observing, and so like he like I don't even know what his voice sounds like because he didn't say anything. He just stood there and observed, and so I think that's how he's able to do it, because he doesn't really go out and have a social life except as like anthropology research of the normies funny. Or whatever. But yeah, it's just this very interesting thing when you meet someone who you've read for a long time, and there's a giant disconnect between their writer's voice and their in-person voice. And so that happened to me with like David Foster Wallace too, when I listened to like a Charlie Rose interview with him. Yeah. And it was just like stumbling over his words, and
he's not very eloquent.
And Nabokov actually said that about himself too. His one of his collections of essays is called "Think, Write, Speak," and it opens by saying, "I think like a genius, I write like a distinguished academic, and I speak like a child." And then he just goes on and talks about how like he's only ever given one live interview, and it was so embarrassing that like he decided he would never do it ever again. And so whenever he does interviews or did interviews, he would ask the interviewer to send him written questions, and he would respond in written form with under the condition that they changed not a single letter of any of the things that he wrote in response back to the
fascinating. That's so fascinating.
Number three. What is, how do you pronounce this? Samotsvetsky?
Samotsvetsky, I think, or Samotsvetsky.
Yeah, Samotsvetsky.
I think it's Eastern European, maybe, not Italian. You moron.
So maybe I'll just read the first paragraph because I think it's probably good to establish what we're talking about. So, Samotsvetsky forecasting is a team of some of the top forecasters in the world. Their job is to assign probabilities to future events. They seem very good at it. They win forecasting contests. They make a lot of money on prediction markets. They get featured in media articles. Sometimes people hire them as consultants when they have some forecasting question relevant to their business. Sometimes some clients will ask Samotsvetsky for a prediction relevant to their business. For example, whether Joe Biden will get impeached. And they'll give a number like it's 17% likely that this thing will happen. This number has some valuable properties. Should I go through these? Maybe pretty close.
Yeah, I might as well, honestly. You're reading it. We can cut it out if it's too much.
So this number has some valuable properties. It's well calibrated. So things that they assign 70% probability to will happen about 70% of the time. If you change this number, it's not going to work. It's pretty close to what prediction markets, experts, and other super forecasters would converge on. Whenever something happens that makes Joe Biden's impeachment more likely, this number will go up and vice versa. If you were someone whose job involved adjusting for situations like these, for example, an oil trader who thought that Joe Biden getting impeached would change oil prices, you would do better at your job over the long run by treating it as 17% likely that Joe Biden will be impeached than by guessing randomly or consistently taking some other number that didn't come from this company. To conclude, in other words, there's something special about the number 17% on this question. It has properties that other numbers like 38% or 99% don't have.
Yeah, nice. So this basically folds in to the first section where he thinks you can just basically cash out the value of giving these kind of numbers because these numbers have these special properties. They're well calibrated. So if people say something happens roughly 20% of the time, it happens roughly 20% of the time. So there's a lot to talk about here. We also did a previous episode on super forecasting, and I think my views were slightly less well formed when we talked about that. That was sort of an initial foray into that. But if people are interested, they can go back and listen to that. Maybe I'll just start out by saying at a high level, I'm just sort of skeptical that the super forecasting stuff is as accurate as people are making it out to be. And there's been some nice recent articles written by people who were initially interested in super forecasting.
Oh, great.
And very bullish on it. Wait, bullish on it? Is that the right one? I always forget. Yeah. Just saying that some of Tetlock's original statistics were not as robust as someone would have liked them to be.
We'll link to that as well.
Yeah. So I'll quote some stuff for that. So anyway, my general critique is, which we can get more into, is that I'm just sort of skeptical that they're as accurate as claimed. So I think a good way to maybe express my skepticism is that I think super forecasting is less a story of that there's a special class of people who can see into the future and pull these magical numbers out of thin air that describe the future, and more a story of if you think carefully about the world, read widely, and aren't dogmatic, then you can see the world more clearly than people who are pundits and who are incentivized to say, for instance, inflammatory things on the news to get views. So if you compare a class of people who are generally truth-seeking about the world versus a class of people who just have other incentives at play because they need to keep their job on cable news, or they, trying to keep their Substack audience up by saying provocative things, then yeah, I don't. And I think that's actually, that second class of people is most people when it comes to commenting on the future. And so that sort of just willingness or desire to see the world clearly translates a little bit. So mostly it translates into just being a little bit less biased in your views. That in turn translates a little bit into better prediction. And that's not a huge surprise because the world it's not totally unpredictable. The world's not totally chaotic in some sense. So it's not surprising that you can find certain patterns and regularities that help you project things in the future. And if you doubt that, then just examine your own behavior day to day, right? There's a lot of things you're taking for granted about tomorrow and assumptions you're making about the next week and the week after based on how the world is today. And so it's not surprising that people who are just thinking carefully about the world can sort of pick up on some of those regularities. I think there's a huge limit to how far that sort of thing can go. And there's a huge limit to like how precise you can be in your numbers. And then there's also issues about like how they're measuring these things, et cetera. But yeah, that's my general current take on super forecasting and stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that Scott Alexander in his review of Tetlock's book made the same point, that super forecasters, like I quoted him in either a blog post or in a podcast episode, super forecasters are just people who don't hold too strongly to their views, are willing to change their mind when new evidence comes in. Importantly, they aren't people who ever use Bayes' theorem, which is something that I would love to ask Scott. When's the last time you actually used Bayes' theorem to do anything of consequence, to make any sort of decision? But that's a secondary point. And I would decently be willing to bet, I'd be curious to see the results of this at least, that I would say that all of the readers of Scott's blog would probably be categorized as super forecasters if they took the time to do the giant freaking list of like scorecard predictions that Scott does. I imagine that when people hear the word super forecaster, they think about other brilliant prophets that can see into the future probabilistically further than the person reading the word super forecaster can. But I can't say for sure, but I would be interested to see the results, and I would bet a small amount of money that all of the commenters, all of the people who read Scott's blog would do roughly better than average, because when Tetlock does these tests, he just gets a random sample from the population, right? And in the population, there's going to be people who, just go based on the last thing that they read in the news, and but you're already filtering for like a decently high intelligence people who read long form essays and blogs, and so most people who are reading this probably themselves are super forecasters, I would be willing to say.
And just changing the incentives is big there, right? Going from like news pundit to being incentivized to think carefully about the future. That does a lot of work for you already. Sorry.
The other thing is that Tetlock says at the end of his book in the appendix that any forecast greater than like 10 years is just delusional and you should not even attempt it. There was a survey, Effective Altruism Forum post about how calibrated people are when they go out into the future. I think I had to issue a correction based on what I said to Nick Anios, and I don't remember how incorrect I characterized it in that episode, but without giving super precise numbers, it was something like the calibration starts to taper off pretty quickly after like a couple year horizon. So the super forecasting thing doesn't go too far into the future. Scott didn't talk about Brier scores here, but there's an interesting thing about Brier scores that we didn't talk about in the last episode that I want to mention that I picked up somewhere on the internet, which is that, okay, so if you're Metaculus, so let me just attack Metaculus a little bit. And we should say to the listeners, so Metaculus was started by a grant from Scott Alexander. So Scott is very personally invested in the success of Metaculus, which I think is relevant information because he talks about it a lot. So Metaculus will often talk about how good their Brier score is. Brier score of like 0.17 or something. So now let's imagine we make a copy of Metaculus. So you and I start our own super forecasting platform, and we take all of Metaculus's questions, and we take the years that the predictions are made, and we just knock off 2 years from it. So if instead of super forecasting or super intelligence being created in 2030, it's 2028 or something. All the questions get proportionally easier, and our Brier score will go down. So we can change the Brier score arbitrarily depending on how difficult or easy the questions are. So if all the questions are essentially 50-50 coin flips, like are we going to terraform Mars by 2300? Then the best you could possibly do, a super forecaster doing the best they could do would be 50% across the board. So the more you move the questions to be all 50% questions, the more your Brier score will just naturally go up. And the more you move your questions to will the sun rise tomorrow, the Brier score will go down. So when you get,
we should say the Brier score going down is good.
Is good, good. Yeah.
So a low Brier score is what, like a Brier score of 0 would be perfectly calibrated.
Yeah. So when you get a number like 0.17 or whatever Metaculus is saying their Brier score is, they want to say, well, this is great because we're beating 0.25. So 0.25 would be if you just do random guessing. But there's no way to know if that is a function of how difficult the questions are. And you could arbitrarily make your Brier score higher or lower based on asking easier or harder questions. And that is very important because the Brier score is like seen as one of the major things that are why people trust super forecasters in the first place. I'm realizing that this isn't addressing Scott's major points, so we have to go through those as well. But I just want to comment that there's so much just kind of like sneaky things happening when people talk about super forecasters that give a very misleading impression. And if it's true, like the thing that would change my mind immediately is like a news article that says like companies' profits skyrocket upon hiring of a super forecasting team. I've never seen such a thing, and I don't expect to. And there's a reason that hedge funds don't really use super forecasters very much. And so I imagine that there is some benefit to hiring this Eastern European naming forecasting company, who I won't even attempt to pronounce. But I imagine the benefit is that you just get a bunch of like thoughtful people coming into your building and then talking through certain issues and going through the reasoning process and just helping you make a decision based on just being thoughtful, intelligent folks. But there's no magic solution here that's going to give you the right answer.
Okay, yeah, nice. So yeah, okay, there's a lot here. First, maybe I'll just defend us by saying I think it is important to talk about this because this is often how the defense is cashed out. Right? It's like, okay, all these philosophical arguments aside, there's such a thing as super forecasting, and what the hell are they doing? Like, how are they so successful if this subjective probability on crazy one-off events is not meaningful or valuable? Like, what's going on here? So I think just to defend our obsession with this for a second, it is important to grapple with exactly what's going on here. So you brought up a number of nice points. The first, which I just want to echo, is that, so Scott says that Sam Matsvetsky or whatever is employed in a number of places, but contrary to his usual style, I think only provides one link.
Yeah.
Like he just says they're employed by a bunch of stuff. I'm a little skeptical of this. So like I did a deep dive on the Good Judgment project, which is a different super forecasting project.
Well, that's Tetlock's.
Tetlock's, yeah, exactly. And his whole thing, he's changed his research focus to like helping super forecasting and getting it into the public eye and like having it be used by.
No, he's doing like business consulting and stuff, right? Like,
yeah, but like trying to get it used by like governments and businesses and stuff. Like this is like the role of the Good Judgment. Like they can be hired, they'll send people in there to help you. And if you go to like their success stories, like who they've worked with, there's just not that much there. And you would expect that if you've ever been on a project where this is a bit of a cheap shot, but if you've ever taken part in some sort of effort and you've like built a website for yourselves or something and you're trying to make yourself look quite legitimate and you'll list some of the stuff that you've done, but you don't quite have enough, but like there's certain tactics you could use to try and like make it seem like you've done more than you can. It's just their website reeks of that to me. Like I can't.
Hilarious. That's great.
And so this is a total cheap shot, but like I would just recommend going to the Good Judgment Project website and looking at like testimonials or something, and you'll see what I mean. It's just a little bit sketchy.
Just like if it's true, which he says in one of his bullets that all super forecasting organizations will converge on the same number, then you would expect him to not talk about the only one good one, Smearty Vacky, or whatever the hell it's called. Like, where's the Good Judgment Project? Why aren't they leading the board? Or why aren't they all equal if they're all going to give you the same numbers? They should be exactly the same if it was the case that they'll just Okay, I know what the response is. It's going to be converge in the limit, blah, blah, blah. But that is exactly the point.
Almond's theorem, baby.
Yeah, we're never in the limit. And so we're never going to converge. And so you're just going to get random freaking numbers flying out at you.
In the limit, we're all dead, as John Maynard Keynes said to Hayek.
That's good.
It all links back together.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so anyway, just the fact that like we're claiming that superforecasting is super valuable, and then so why isn't it being used by more organizations? So either you have to just say, okay, it's not that valuable, such that organizations are not going out of their way to use it. That would be my claim. Or you have to, I don't know, you have to give some other reason why institutions aren't picking up on this. Maybe they're just scared of all the productivity gains they'd get, or governments are scared about how accurate their foreign policy is.
Or here's an even better question. Like, why the fuck is Tetlock trying to sell his product to companies when he could just be betting on the stock market?
yeah, sure. Like, why aren't all these people super rich?
Yeah, precisely. I think you made this point in a very succinct tweet, which is like, so all the super forecasters are really rich, right? No, it looks like they're making very desperate websites trying to get people to buy their product.
Okay, so some other points now. So I have 2 points to make. One, I just wanted to quote this paragraph from the piece I referenced earlier, discussing that Tetlock's earlier results were perhaps not as significant as he made them out to be. So this is a piece by Gavin Leach and Misha Yagudin, who were both very pro super forecasting, but just wanted to do a deep dive into the numbers, because it seems like no one had actually done that since Tetlock's book himself. People kind of just took Tetlock's word at face value, as is kind of reasonable. So this is in an article for the Institute of Progress. And they're taking issue with the claim that super forecasters are 30% more accurate than expert political pundits. Okay. And quote, they say the following: "The playing field is actually a bit more level than these eye-catching stats imply. A closer look at the 30% claim led to an unpublished study that indeed describes a 35% difference. But the paper's comparison between experts and super forecasters was not apples to apples. The aggregation method used for forecasters is known to produce better results than the one used for the expert analysts. A fair comparison found a 10% advantage for the amateurs," meaning the super forecasters, "but not reaching statistical significance."
Well, and to add to this, so Tetlock's first half of his career is talking about how experts are worse than average. So what this is saying is that people are 10% better than people who are worse than average.
Worse than average, yeah. 10% worse than average?
Yeah,
wait a second.
Yeah, so maybe you are like 52% compared to randomly flipping coins or something. But yeah, just to add that experts aren't better than average. Experts,
yeah, that's a great point.
Tetlock's own admission and study, like that was the first half of his work. So it's so interesting. If he stopped his legacy at like, you guys quit believing people who think they can predict the future, then he would go down in the annals of history as doing a great service. But instead he pivoted and he's like, well, actually there is a way to predict the future. And that's if you use Bayes. And then he just completely, like, everyone's forgotten about his first book in his first half of his career. It's very bizarre. You had 2 points you wanted to make, and I think I interrupted.
So the second one is slightly more technical. If it's too technical, we'll just cut this. But I'd like to get the intuition across somehow, because I think it is important. Yeah. All the super forecasting stats, when they're computing these accuracies, these Breyer scores, they are on average across a whole class of events. Okay. And so these are called marginal guarantees in statistics. And marginal guarantees are known to be quite weak. So here's an example. Going back to just like the predicting heads and tails, whether a coin will flip, 50%. So fair coin, 50% heads, 50% tails. If you predict 50% every time, you're going to be perfectly well calibrated.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. But this tells you nothing about the next coin flip, right? And so this comes down to just like predicting the average of a distribution it's not an impressive task in some sense. Like just knowing about the mean of something is not impressive. This just comes down to the properties of means in some sense. And so there's a reason that like in machine learning, in statistics, very rarely people think about marginal guarantees. That's the first thing you try and do. And then as soon as you do that, which you typically can, you start thinking about what are called conditional guarantees. So conditional on like what's actually happening, some properties of the next observation you're seeing, then you try and say something about it. So to try and make this concrete with like the COVID epidemic, most of the time when you detect a new virus, it's not going to end up in a worldwide pandemic. Okay. So we detect something new in animals or even humans, something, right? We don't know what it is, but most of the time we don't end up in lockdown for a year. And so at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the superforecasters, I think on Metaculus, gave it like a 2% chance or 3% chance of becoming a worldwide pandemic. They were wrong about this in some sense, but they might have been right on average. If you look across all the times we detected some new virus, how many times has it become a pandemic? Yeah, probably something like 2% of the time. So in some sense, the super forecasters are very well calibrated. But for actually like making decisions about the future, you don't give a shit about the average case scenario. You want to say, okay, based like the fact
what do I do now? What do I do now?
Yeah, what do I do now? And you want the specifics of the case. So you want like it was discovered in Wuhan, it was all this stuff. And so if they had conditional Breyer scores based on the features of the scenario at hand, and so we're making more than marginal predictions, and we're more than marginally calibrated, I would be way more impressed. But obviously, this is almost impossible to do because the future evolves and everything looks different over time and stuff. And so, yeah, hopefully that didn't become too technical, but I want to drill this distinction between just being correct on average and being correct for the next case. And those are hugely consequentially different for actually reasoning about the world and doing things and taking actions. But mathematically, you can say, oh, I'm well calibrated, even when you're totally wrong about the next thing that's coming down the pipeline.
100%. I mean, this just speaks to the usefulness of a lot of this stuff, because let's say I have just a very difficult business decision to make, and you bring in the world's leading super forecasters who are very, quote, well calibrated. They're going to say, yep, I don't know. Yep, I really don't know. 50%, don't know.
They'll just look at the base rates, right?
And I was like, I don't know. I don't know. And they'll be saying, I don't know, which, like we said earlier, is equivalent to saying 50% probability. And they'll get all the clout for being very well calibrated, while providing nothing of value whatsoever to the person who's hired them. And this is a point that I was trying to make in maybe less clear ways than you've just made it in my exchange with Mauricio, which is that like all these numbers don't factor in both the import of the prediction and like how much it frickin' matters, or how difficult it is. Because if you have just a list of very challenging questions, and the true answer is 50 or coin flips across all of them, then you're going to walk out of there with a Tetlock patting you on the back saying, great job, you super forecaster, you, while having just basically said, don't know. And I think a lot of super forecasters are people who rightly say, I don't know more. And that's a valuable thing to have if you want to be humble and epistemically safe, I guess. Like, you don't want to be overly confident on stuff. But that's very different than knowing how to see into the future. So one of my main questions for Scott, if he ever listens to this, which I'm sure he won't, but here's an experiment I would love to see that he could run trivially tomorrow. And all he would do is say, okay, if you self-identify as a super forecaster, here's a list of 100 questions. I want all of you super forecasters to independently give me your probabilities. I'm not going to average them. I'm just going to show the variance. And I'm going to show the variance. And let's see how converged y'all think, you think you're converged, how converged you actually are. And I'm going to guess that there's going to be a pretty wide variance between the 60, 70, 80, 90% band. Meaning that once you eliminate the very easy questions and the very difficult questions, then you just pretty much have a bunch of random guesses. I don't know this for sure, but I know that like Scott is, quote, well calibrated because he runs these surveys all the time. But his claim is that any super forecaster will get the same numbers. He caveats that by saying in the limit, and mathematically that's true. But from a real, like, what are we actually doing here, people perspective, we don't care about the limit. We care about like right now. Like, I want to see that Metaculus and all the top winners on Metaculus and Scott and the Sam Scardy Fardy people and the better judgment, the good judgment people, when they're given a question, they all independently will say 70% of the same question. I'm willing to bet that's not going to happen. And the reason I don't think that's going to happen is because Metaculus does aggregations, right? So if all the super forecasters are betting on the same thing, then there shouldn't be like a spread. It should just all be exactly the same number. And this, I think, gets closer to the main claims that Scott makes in this section, which is that he says that this number has some valuable properties. It's well calibrated. Okay, so if it's well calibrated, then independent super forecasters should all guess the same number. I claim that you're going to have a variance, and the variance is probably going to be like wide enough that that interesting band of where people quote are calibrated is going to be pretty spread. So if you're getting 70s, 60s, 80s, and 90s from people for a question that's actually 70, then when any one independent super forecaster comes and gives you their number, why should you trust that one any more than any other number that you could be given if you ask somebody else? So I don't think this number has. Yeah, you need a whole crew of them. You need to aggregate. But if you quote need a whole crew of them, then it very much defeats the whole purpose that he's trying to say, because he's saying that if this company gives you a 17% number, you can take that shit to the bank. That is 100% what's going to happen, probabilistically.
But can be careful with you.
That's going to happen with certainty, probably.
This is where the rhetoric gets out of control.
But my high level comment and attempt at refuting his whole "this number has valuable properties" thing is that the number does not have valuable properties. What has valuable properties is the brand recognition of the company who's given you the number. So if I give you a number, so just the 17% number that he's saying has all these special properties associated with it, but I don't tell you who produced the number, then it loses all the properties. So the properties are not associated with a number. The properties are associated with the brand of the person who's produced it. So it's not the number, and that's why he's wrong about the 4 properties that he enumerates, because it's the fact that it came from a company who he trusts, who presumably, if you ask them how they arrived at that number, could give you their rationale. But it's not the number, because the number divorced from the source of the number is a number without any of the properties which he's said the number has.
Although he would say this number is like more well calibrated than other numbers, right? Like if you give this number your prior scores.
But that's only because the well calibratedness comes from the Can you just say it once so I actually get it?
I think now you've confused me.
Yeah.
I think it's Samet-Sveti.
Samet-Sveti.
I think so.
So it's only quote well calibrated because it comes from Samet-Sveti, right? But I'm just saying run this whole experiment, but just don't include where the number came from. Or not the whole experiment, the whole argument in this section. If you just black out that bit of it, then the number loses its properties. But if it was a property of the number, then that wouldn't happen, right?
But no, wait though. But it's not Samet-Sveti that's determining the calibration score, right? Like the event.
Oh,
so
no,
they're giving
it's knowing that Samet-Sveti is quote calibrated that allows you to super duper well trust the fact that when they say it's 17% likely that Joe Biden will get impeached, then you can take that number to the bank. But it's not the 17% number that's conveying that properties. It's the information that we have about Samet-Sveti being calibrated, not the 17. Because
I see what
it's true. Yeah, if his argument is the case, then you could just take that 17% number and just move it all around the internet without any attachment to the source of it, and then it should have all the same properties. But if you don't like this argument, then
I don't love this argument. I mean,
then it probably won't make it into the blog post. But tell me why you don't like it.
Well, I don't like it for the reason that if I give you 100 numbers, which are my probabilities for 100 events, okay, those 100 numbers are going to be more or less well calibrated. Okay, that's a property of the number. Doesn't matter who gave you those numbers.
That's a property of the source of the number, right? Like
no, the numbers determine the numbers determine your Breyer score, and then whether the event happened or not. It has nothing to do. It's not like Samet-Sveti has their own Breyer score computation going on. But
his claim isn't saying that Samet-Sveti is properties of the number that he's talking about aren't properties of this test suite of calibration questions that he's asking. He's saying it's exclusively this one question and this one number associated with this one outcome about Joe Biden getting impeached. And so the only reason that number has any of these properties is because you go back to the source of it, and you know that source has presumably, that the company's not lying, has done this whole calibration thing. But I'm saying it's the source that's produced the number, not the number.
So you're saying, but I see what you're saying, but I think you're not quite hewing to the spirit of his argument. I think you're being slightly unfair to him here. Like, what he wants to say is people give different numbers, and some of those numbers give better calibration scores than other numbers. And a company like Sametsveti ostensibly gives better, the numbers that they give you end up with calibration curves that looks nicer than other people's calibration curves. That's kind of the claim he's making. And that's true. That's a true claim.
Yeah. Well, I'm claiming that when he says that this number has valuable properties, that's incorrect. What he's saying is this forecasting agency has valuable properties.
Yeah, I think what you're trying to say is, why are people listening to this number? And it's because of the track record of this company, and not the number itself. So for instance, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between, you just run this experiment once and you're in one world, Sametsveti gives you a 17%. And in world 2, they give you 33%. You can't tell what the difference is between those numbers because this event only happens once. And so they've given you a probability and you're trusting it just based on their history.
Well, he's saying these numbers have special properties. And I'm saying, so yeah, in one world, you're given the number 17%. And in another world, you're given the number 17%, and you're told that it comes from Sametsveti. And I'm saying that you get the special properties when you're told that information. And that indicates that it's not the number, it's the origin of the number. He's assigning valuable properties to the wrong location, is what I'm trying to say. It's not the number, it's the fact that presumably this Sametsveti forecasting organization has a good track record and is a good reputation, etc.
Which is a function, but the track record is a function of the numbers that they're giving you. Because it's their past calibration. Like, that's the point.
But so do you think you think it's accurate to say that this number has special properties, and it's not accurate for me to say that those properties are coming from this, like, the quote experts?
So you're arguing, I think you're arguing about like the one-off versus on average. I mean,
well, no, he's arguing the one-off. So the whole point of this four-bullet section, right, is that
the spirit of his argument is the numbers. I sort of agree with you in the one-off case, because it's just you can't judge 17%. You know, this Joe Biden either gets elected or he doesn't. So you can't judge a 17% as a 17% accuracy on one event. That's impossible to do. So instead, they give you 17% and you judge. You say, okay, am I going to believe this? I'm going to place my bets on this based on their history, right? How good they've done. But the spirit of his argument is that over time, as they're giving you these numbers, you're going to bet on their numbers more than you're going to bet on anyone else's numbers, because their numbers are more accurate over time. And this is putting aside all the issues that we've discussed with the measurement of accuracy and stuff, obviously. But like...
no, okay. Yeah, I take that. Yeah, that's fair.
You're either making a super subtle point or you're misunderstanding what he's trying to say, I think. Last comment about the super forecasting thing is just a bit of a cheap shot, but I just think it's hilarious that there's this huge intersection of the number of the people who take super forecasting seriously and the people who are like super obsessed with AI doom and like assigning P dooms and stuff. And then when they run the actual experiment of taking super forecasters as certified by them and ask them what the probability that AI is going to destroy the world is, it's super low. And none of them change their fucking mind. And it's
amazing.
Just... And the only, like, awesome. No one is self-aware about it except for Scott, who did write one post being like, yeah, this is a thing. They think it's going to happen like 0.001. I actually have the number somewhere where 0.38%. So not 0.38, 0.38%. So like less than less than a percent. So that's the super forecasters that there's going to be an AI extinction.
Amazing. Okay, this gets right to the next section very nicely.
And then Scott, I tweeted about this. No one seemed to care. It blows my mind that no one cares, because you'd think if you took super forecasting seriously, this would be the best news ever. right? Now you can stop worrying about AI risk. And no one has stopped worrying about it. If anything, it's gotten worse. Scott did remark upon this. He just said, okay, like they disagree with me and this should update me to a really low probability, but it just doesn't. Like I think he said just I can't make the probability generating part of my brain, make my numbers go that low. That shows the whole problem with the whole thing. Like just in a nutshell, we could have just talked about that. Like there's just it's hilarious. Amazing. They're like the numbers are perfectly valuable until they're not. until you disagree with them, and then you say, yeah. Well, so until it's like, wait a second, oh god.
Well, so in the next section, before I set it up, he just gives the example of Yoshua Bengio, and so some people get really mad if you mention that Yoshua Bengio says that the probability of AI causing a global catastrophe is 20%. Okay, well, why did he choose that expert and not the superforecasters if he's just been talking about the superforecasters for so long? And this just goes to the major problem of like everyone at the end of the day has to choose the experts they want to believe in. And some experts are going to have high numbers, some experts are going to have low numbers, and some experts, like the ones that I like to listen to, just reject the idea of putting probabilities on things at all, like Melanie Mitchell and Gary Marcus, for example. I don't know if Marcus has done that, but Melanie Mitchell definitely said she wasn't going to in her monk debate with Tegmark, and which was one of the worst debate partners I've ever. Tegmark was
fucking so chaotic,
bad. It's Tegmark and Bengio. It's Tegmark and Bengio.
Yeah, right.
And so it's just a really excellent point that Scott's section 4 title is "Do people use probability as a substitute for reasoning?" And one of the examples he gives just perfectly indicates that they do, and they use it for bad reasoning often. It's not even just good reasoning, but it's bad reasoning. But I did not steal man or even attempt to describe his argument in this section, so I don't know if you want to.
I mean, I think we've touched on it before. It's just that he's basically saying the reasoning process comes before, the probability is the output of the reasoning process. Sort of nobody works in probability land all the time. You do your reasoning, then you spit out a probability. Yeah, we've addressed this previously, saying like, well, then why? Like, it seems like the spitting out a probability point is completely useless, right? Because if anyone disagrees with you, then you just descend back into the land of argumentation. Honestly, if this is how you go about it all the time, then I'm fine with this. Like, if you want to do all your reasoning, whenever you argue with me, we argue arguments in English, and then you put a probability on everything at the end. I don't care, like whatever. But the issue is you can tell this story to yourself where the probability is only an outcome of a reasoning process, but then, like I've been saying, you can forget that all of a sudden and start treating it as the same sort of numbers you're getting out of very robust statistical models that are like modeling whatever, something backed up by tons of data, right? And then you start feeding it into downstream processes or telling people, and then they start aggregating your scores with other people and start making decisions based off that. And that's where it's super dangerous. So, if we were in a world where everyone just totally recognized that, yeah, we're all arguing about stuff, and then at the end of the day, icing on the cake, we assign a probability to our beliefs, like whatever, I don't give a shit, right? It's just like we're sort of all acknowledging at that point that it's not that useful anyway. But the problem is people start using these numbers and taking them very seriously and make decisions based on them. And so it feels sort of disingenuous to say, the probability doesn't do the reasoning for you. It's just the result of it. But then you have all these people making decisions based on a result of this. Like, I don't know.
Okay. Is there anything you want to say about section 4 that we haven't talked about? Like his arguments here are fairly weak, just essentially saying that there's a big difference between a number coming from an expert who you have reason to believe has done a lot of great reasoning compared to just some Joe Mo. To which my main response is, well, how do you choose the expert? And then your response, which is, and this is just the beginning of the conversation, no one just stops with the numbers except the AI doom and gloom scenario community. Which, like, I just want to remark that this probability stuff is only really talked about and used in this way amongst the AI doomer crowd and the EA and the less wrong people, and then some niche academic philosophers and stuff. But like, no other communities reason this way, think this way. It's not as if the US government is paralyzed in their decision-making abilities because they aren't up to date with Bayes' theorem. Like, no one actually does any of the stuff in practice except for this very microcosmic blogging circle. It's often not remarked upon when you're reading the blogs themselves.
Maybe just suffice it to say as well, like the benefit of formal sort of statistics and probability here that aren't just based on beliefs is precisely when like you agree on the model, and then you can start objectively judging people's answers to various problems like within that model, and you can argue about it and reason about what you expect to see, all this sort of stuff. But in like something like super forecasting or just assigning credences to beliefs, etc., there's no like formal way to do this. You just jump right from arguments to sort of arbitrarily assigning a number to the strength of your belief. And so I think our claim here is just what exactly is the benefit here versus when you have some formal system that you're working in. The benefit precisely comes from like once you've agreed on that formal system, that will better, that will match the world to greater and lesser extents. The whole George box, all models are wrong, some are useful thing. And then you can do a bunch of calculus within that model, and that's useful. But you don't have those sort of tools when you're just dealing with all these random subjective numbers. And so you sort of lose all of the benefit.
Yeah, well, that's actually a good point. It's like, it's hard to even call them probabilities. When I think about probability, I think abiding by the calculus of probability, the sum and the product rule, et cetera, et cetera. But no one ever does any of those algebraic manipulations on any of these numbers. They're just spat out at the end of the day. And so like maybe they multiply them sometimes, but there's no conditioning, there's no marginalization, there's no normalization, there's none of that stuff that you do when you actually are dealing with real probabilities. They're just numbers with little percentage signs afterwards. And then sometimes you multiply them. But that's about it.
Scott is doing this weird thing where he says, so he gets around the objection that you've just raised by saying, okay, let's not call it probability. We'll call it some other word, schmobability. And then he wants to say, but schmobability seems like a good heuristic for like, what's the chance something's going to happen? What's the chance Biden's actually going to win the election?
It reminded me of another point that I just wanted to make about the schmobabilities thing. So he's basically saying, fine, if you don't want to call it a probability, let's call it something else. Let's call it schmobability, and then kind of makes fun of that. But no, how about we just call it a subjective belief score? Like, it's not that the labeling is arbitrary. It's that we want to label it in such a way that it reduces confusion. And so if we call it something where the label reminds people that this is a different kind of thing than an objective chance, then that's useful. But calling it schmobability just doesn't engage with any of the serious critiques that are being leveled against subjective probabilities, because he's just kind of trivializing it. No, we come up with new words for things precisely when there's confusion that has consequences. And so we would distinguish between different types of probability precisely because it matters if you're dealing with an objective chance of something happening, or if you're dealing with a belief, or if you're dealing with counting stuff. And so it just was a very bad attempt at arguing against a straw man argument, I guess. Nice. Well, so let's conclude. I know this has been a bit long. So we have number 5. Is AI even more unmodelable than Mars landings or politics? I'll just read the first paragraph. A remaining objection. We at least know sort of how rockets work. We at least know who controls Congress and what impeachment is, and approximately what kind of guy Joe Biden is. So we have some starting point for modeling these questions. We barely know anything about the future of AI. So if you come up with the probability of Joe Biden's impeachment, probabilities about the future of AI are bunk. That's actually a pretty decent steel man of the case. To which his response is, I agree that because of the thorniness of this question, probabilities about AI are more lightly held than probabilities about Mars or impeachment. But I think the best way to represent your lightly held opinion is with a probability. Well, my response to this is, based on what you just told me, that his probability of AI is not lightly held if he's not willing to change it when the superforecasters have a different probability.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, nice.
So he is not lightly holding his probabilities at all, because he's not going to change them when the people he's been just celebrating as being the brilliant super forecasting, like, you got to trust these guys. If they disagree with him, he's like, nah, I'm still going to keep my probability. I'll go with a different one. I'll go with Bengio's. This is better. So no, it's not lightly holding anything. It's shopping around to find experts who are as scared of stupid shit as you are, and then using their big numbers. So I just don't buy his claim.
I mean, I think, we've basically gone through all the objections here. Like, I would just want to say, these they're pretty useless numbers. It's also weird for him to contrast it versus like Mars or Congress, because those are also things I'd say, I don't really trust many people betting on this either. Yeah. Like, if you start comparing these to, like you said, rates of miscarriage, or even sports betting and stuff, when you have tons of data, you've watching a baseball star take a swing, like thousands of times, comparing this to betting on AI, like, it's just incomparable. So, Yeah, but I think going into here, I'm just going to rehash the same arguments, but I just don't think this is very useful.
Well, okay. That was the summary of our thoughts on this particular piece.
All right. Hopefully that was fun. And I don't think Scott listens to the podcast, so extremely unlikely that he hears this. But Scott, if you're listening, we love you.
Yeah, or send it to him. Get him to listen to it somehow. Bombard him, listeners. Yeah. Hell yeah, man. That's fun. Cool.
Sweet.
Continue.
See you.
Boom.